All right, strap yourselves in for today's deep dive. We're heading straight into the center of Pakistani politics.
Buckle up.
You got it. We're doing a single source deep dive this time and focusing entirely on a hard talk interview that was done recently with Imran Khan,
Yep.
the former prime minister of Pakistan.
Okay.
And as you know, I mean, he's facing like almost 200 legal charges.
Yeah.
And this interview, I mean, it gets right into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, and this is, I think, it's particularly fascinating because it's such a sort of microcosm of what's going on in Pakistan right now.
Right.
You know, it's not just Khan defending himself. It's really a window into a political system where legal battles and these kinds of accusations are almost par for the course.
Yeah.
It's how you play the game of politics over there.
It's almost Shakespearean, right?
Right.
You have a rise to power, and then potentially with the military's backing,
Right.
and then they turn on you.
Yeah.
But before we get into all of that, let's start with these charges, right?
Right.
We're talking terrorism, sedition, blasphemy.
The whole 9 yards.
Yeah, even murder.
Yeah.
And Khan claims that this is all an attempt to basically disqualify him from running for office again.
Yeah, so to really kind of grasp how significant this is, you have to look at, Pakistan's history.
Right.
And sadly, using legal charges to kind of sideline political opponents is nothing new. I mean, it's a pattern that we've seen kind of repeat itself over different regimes, right?
All right.
And it really speaks to the fragility of a true democratic process in Pakistan.
Right, so not exactly a level playing field then, but what about these specific charges against Khan? I mean, he calls them frivolous and bogus.
Right.
From what you've seen, I mean, are any of them particularly credible or concerning?
That's where it gets really interesting. I mean, while Khan vehemently denies any wrongdoing, you can't ignore that some of these accusations, particularly those related to, inciting violence and the events surrounding May 9th, do carry weight, given the evidence that's been presented.
Right, May 9th, so this is when Khan was arrested.
Right.
And things really exploded, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was a turning point.
Yeah.
May 9th, I mean, the images of unrest, they really shocked the nation and the world. And it really begs the question, did Khan cross a line from, strong political rhetoric to actually actively instigating this violence? And that's something, of course, the courts are going to have to, grapple with. But the political damage, it's already done.
And yet, Khan maintains that he was abducted by commandos, not police.
Right.
Which fueled the unrest.
Yeah.
He even draws this parallel to, how Nawaz Sharif was barred from politics due to those corruption charges. And he's kind of pointing out this irony that he's now facing very similar tactics that he once supported.
Yeah.
It's almost like this political boomerang,
Yeah, and it really speaks to this deeper issue, which is this cyclical nature of these power struggles and how, successive regimes kind of deploy these similar tactics. And it makes you wonder, is real change even possible within such a system?
Well, and that kind of leads us to another key player in all of this, which is the military.
Right.
Khan initially enjoyed their support, but then later accused them of orchestrating his removal.
Yep.
He even called the current government a puppet of the military,
right,
which for our listener means that they're essentially, under their control. And he's claiming that this plan to basically oust him was in motion as far back as 2020. And he points to these statements from, current government officials as evidence of that. To understand this, though, we have to unpack this complicated relationship between civilian governments and the military establishment in Pakistan. So walk us through that. What's the backstory here? How much influence does the military really have?
Well, historically, the military has played a very significant role in Pakistani politics.
Right.
Often intervening directly or exerting a lot of influence behind the scenes. So this dynamic that we see with Khan, first allying with them and then accusing them of betrayal.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a classic example of how things can shift so rapidly in Pakistani politics.
Right, and adding to this whole drama, we've seen a mass exodus from Khan's PTI party,
right,
with high-profile figures like Fawad Chaudhry, his former information minister,
right,
and Jahangir Tareen, a key financier, jumping ship.
Yeah, the implosion of the PTI is really significant. I mean, it's not just about individuals leaving; it's about these deeper fissures that have emerged within the party.
Right.
And a loss of confidence in Khan's leadership. And this begs the question, with the PTI so fractured, what are the viable political alternatives?
Well, some have called for Khan to build bridges with other political leaders, even his arch-rival Nawaz Sharif,
Right.
to try and avert this national crisis. But,
Yeah.
I mean, is that even remotely possible? These are some deep-seated rivalries we're talking about here.
The feasibility of such alliances is definitely debatable. Pakistani politics, it's often characterized by this deep mistrust, this personal animosity between leaders, and
Right.
forging a genuine coalition would require a level of compromise and reconciliation that, frankly, we just haven't seen in the past.
Yeah,
So, it's a tall order,
it is.
to say the least.
So we've got all this political maneuvering, fractured parties, a powerful military kind of lurking in the background. It's a pretty intense landscape. But I'm curious, what does all this mean for ordinary Pakistanis? They're the ones that are kind of caught in the crossfire here.
You're absolutely right to bring that up. The current situation is creating a lot of anxiety for the average Pakistani. The economic crisis is a huge burden. I mean, inflation is through the roof. Jobs are scarce, and basic necessities are becoming harder and harder to afford.
You mentioned earlier that Pakistan narrowly avoided default thanks to this IMF bailout. But what does that actually mean for people on the ground? What are the strings attached to these bailouts?
Well, these IMF bailouts, they do provide this lifeline, this financial lifeline, but they often come with certain conditions.
Right.
And these can include things like, austerity measures, cuts to public spending and demands for economic reforms. It can be pretty painful in the short term.
Right.
So it's a delicate balancing act, trying to, stabilize the economy without causing further hardship for the people.
So it's not just political instability they're dealing with, it's the economic fallout as well. And then you have, the security situation with terrorism rearing its head again. How are these all interconnected? And what does it mean for people trying to live their lives?
Well, the resurgence of terrorism, particularly along the border with Afghanistan, adds this whole other layer of fear and uncertainty.
Right.
And Khan, he makes this compelling argument that this rise in violence is directly linked to the lack of political stability and representative government.
He's saying that when people feel excluded, disenfranchised, it creates fertile ground for extremism.
Right.
It's not just about military operations. It's about addressing the root causes of terrorism.
Absolutely, and that brings us back to this crucial question. Are free and fair elections even possible in the current climate? I mean, Khan insists that elections are the only legitimate way forward, but with all the legal challenges and the potential for interference, it feels like a very fragile hope.
Yeah, I can see why people might be feeling pretty disillusioned, right? It's like they're caught in this cycle of political turmoil and economic hardship with no clear way out. But let's play devil's advocate for a moment. Let's say Khan is right and elections are the solution. Is there any way to create the conditions for them to be truly free and fair?
Well, that's a daunting challenge, but it's not impossible. It would require a pretty monumental shift in the political landscape. We need to see a genuine commitment from all stakeholders. I mean, the government, the military political parties, and civil society to actually uphold democratic principles and ensure a level playing field.
So a best case scenario would involve everyone kind of putting aside their personal ambitions and actually working together for the good of the country. I mean, that's a pretty idealistic vision, isn't it?
It is, but sometimes idealism is what's needed to kind of break a cycle of dysfunction.
Yeah.
Imagine a scenario where, the legal cases against Khan are handled, transparently and fairly, where political parties can campaign without fear of intimidation, and where the military truly takes a step back from political interference.
Okay, that's a hopeful picture, but realistically, how likely is that to happen? I mean, there's so much distrust and animosity between these different factions.
You're right. The odds are stacked against it. But there are factors that could push things in a more positive direction. Pressure from international partners who are concerned about stability in the region could play a role. Or perhaps the realization within Pakistan itself that the status quo is simply unsustainable.
So maybe a combination of internal and external pressures could create enough momentum for change.
It's possible. But even in that optimistic scenario, the path forward wouldn't be easy. I mean, there were deeply entrenched interests at play. And overcoming those would require a level of political will and compromise that we just haven't seen much of lately.
We've talked a lot about the political actors, the institutions, the power dynamics. But I want to bring it back to the human element. You mentioned, the economic anxieties and the fear of terrorism. What are some other key concerns for ordinary Pakistanis right now?
Well, there's this growing sense of disillusionment with the political system itself. People feel like their voices aren't being heard, that the political elite are more interested in these power struggles
Mm.
than in actually addressing their needs.
Right.
And this disillusionment, it can lead to apathy or worse, a willingness to embrace these extremist ideologies.
So it's a vicious cycle. Political instability leads to economic hardship, security concerns, which in turn erode faith in the system, making it even harder to achieve lasting stability. It's like this Gordian knot, with each strand tangled up with the others.
You've hit the nail on the head, and unraveling that knot will require more than just, political maneuvering or economic band-aids. It will require a fundamental shift in the way that power is exercised and shared, and a renewed commitment to actually addressing the needs and aspirations of the Pakistani people.
Speaking of power, let's circle back to Imran Khan. I mean, he's clearly a polarizing figure, but there's no denying his charisma and his ability to connect with a large segment of the population. What do you think explains his enduring appeal, especially in the face of all these challenges?
Khan's appeal stems from a combination of factors. I mean, he's seen as this charismatic outsider, someone who challenges the established order and speaks for the common man. His background as a cricket star also gives him a certain level of, celebrity and name recognition that transcends these traditional political boundaries.
It's almost like he's tapped into this deep yearning for change,
Right.
for a leader who can break free from the old ways of doing things. But at the same time, he's been criticized for his, populist rhetoric, his sometimes authoritarian tendencies, and his willingness to kind of exploit religious and nationalist sentiments for political gain.
You're right. There are legitimate concerns about his approach. Critics argue that he's more interested in personal power than in democratic principles,
Right.
and that his policies are often driven by emotion rather than rational analysis.
So he's a complex figure.
He is.
A mix of strength and weaknesses, hopes and anxieties. But love him or hate him, there's no denying that he's a force to be reckoned with in Pakistani politics.
Absolutely. I mean, he's a catalyst, he's a disruptor, and his presence continues to shape the political landscape in profound ways.
And that brings us to the million-dollar question. What role will he play in the future of Pakistan?
Right.
Will he be a unifying force for positive change? Or will his presence kind of further divide and destabilize the country? It feels like Pakistan is at this crossroads, and Imran Khan is kind of this lightning rod figure,
Yeah.
attracting this fervent support and this really intense opposition. What a story. But let's put on our analytical hats here for a moment
Okay.
and try to make sense of it all. What are some of the possible scenarios that we could see playing out in the coming months?
Well, predicting the future is always a risky business, especially in a place as complex as Pakistan. But, based on what we've discussed, Khan's ambitions, the government's response, the military stance, and these overall economic and security challenges, I think we can explore a few potential paths.
Okay. Let's start with maybe the most dramatic one.
Okay.
What happens if Khan decides to just go all in, and run for office, regardless of these legal hurdles and the risks?
Yeah. I mean, if Khan throws his hat in the ring, it would be a highly charged and potentially destabilizing event. I mean, there's no doubt about it. His presence on the ballot, it would energize his base, but it would also provoke a very strong reaction from his opponents. We could very well see a repeat of the crackdown on the PTI, attempts to restrict campaigning, or even a move to disqualify him from the race altogether.
And knowing Khan, he wouldn't back down easily. How do you think he and his supporters would respond to that kind of pressure?
I think they'd see it as a confirmation of their belief that the system is rigged against them.
Right.
And it could lead to even larger protests than what we saw in May, potentially escalating into, civil unrest and violent clashes.
So in that scenario, elections could become a flashpoint,
Absolutely.
exacerbating the existing divisions and potentially pushing the country further into chaos. What's another possible path?
Another scenario is that Khan is barred from running, either through through legal maneuvering, pressure from the military, or even some kind of negotiated agreement where he steps aside to avoid further turmoil.
But would his supporters accept that?
That's the question.
I mean, they'd probably see it as this blatant attempt to silence him and rob them of their democratic rights.
Exactly. And this scenario, could actually trigger even more anger and resentment, leading to a backlash that's even more intense than what we saw following his arrest. I mean, the PTI, they might boycott the elections, denouncing them as a sham, and call for this mass movement to challenge the government's legitimacy.
So whether he runs or is barred from running, there's a real risk of things kind of spiraling out of control. Is there any scenario where things could play out more peacefully?
Well, there's always the possibility, of a less dramatic, more hopeful path. This would involve some kind of negotiated settlement or a gradual de-escalation of tensions.
What would that look like in practical terms? What kind of compromises would need to be made?
It would require concessions from all sides. Khan, he might need to tone down his rhetoric, agree to certain conditions for his participation in the political process, or even, consider temporarily stepping back from frontline politics to allow things to cool down.
And what about the government? What would they need to do to kind of create an environment that's more conducive to dialogue and reconciliation?
Well, they would need to demonstrate a genuine commitment to upholding democratic norms,
Right.
Ensuring a fair and transparent legal process for Khan, and addressing some of these underlying grievances that fuel his popularity. Things like corruption, economic inequality, things like that.
So in this scenario, we'd see a shift towards dialogue, perhaps some behind the scenes negotiations leading to a more stable political environment in the long run. But let's be honest, that requires a level of trust and goodwill that seems to be in pretty short supply right now.
It does, but remember, external factors can also play a role here. Pressure from international partners, concerns about regional stability, or even economic necessity. These could encourage all sides to seek a less confrontational approach.
That's a good point. Sometimes it takes outside pressure or a shared sense of crisis to bring people to the negotiating table. But we can't forget about the wild card in all of this, which is the military. What role do you see them playing in these different scenarios?
Well, the military stance is absolutely crucial. I mean, if they decide to stay out of politics and allow a genuinely democratic process to unfold, it would significantly increase the chances of a peaceful resolution.
But if they perceive Khan as a threat to their interests, or if they see the situation spiraling out of control, they might be tempted to intervene.
Right.
Even if it means undermining the democratic process.
Precisely. And their perception of Khan is key. If they see him as someone that they can work with, someone who won't, challenge their power or their vision for the country, they might be more inclined to tolerate his political activities.
But if they view him as a disruptor, someone who's too unpredictable or who threatens their core interests,
Right. And then they might be more likely to act to curb his influence.
You've summed it up perfectly. Pakistan's future rests not just on the decisions of its political leaders, but also on the calculations of its powerful military establishment. It's a complex and delicate balance.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener.
Yeah.
It's really highlighted the complexities and the high stakes involved in Pakistani politics. But before we wrap up, I want to zoom out a bit and consider the wider implications. What does all of this mean for the region and for the world?
Well, Pakistan is a nuclear-armed nation, strategically located in a very volatile region. So its stability, or lack thereof, has profound implications for its neighbors, for the fight against terrorism, and for global geopolitics.
So the world is watching very closely as Pakistan navigates this turbulent period.
Absolutely. I mean, a stable and democratic Pakistan, that's in everyone's interest.
Right. It would contribute to regional peace and security, foster economic development, and act as a bulwark against extremism.
But a Pakistan that's consumed by internal strife, political instability, economic crisis, that could become a breeding ground for terrorism, a source of regional tensions, and a major humanitarian challenge.
You've hit the nail on the head. The stakes are incredibly high, not just for Pakistan, but for the wider world.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given our listener a lot to think about. It's a complex and ever-evolving situation, and we'll continue to follow it closely. We've explored the key players, the challenges, the potential scenarios, and the high stakes involved. But for now, we have to leave it there.
Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of Pakistani politics, and we encourage you to continue exploring this topic and engaging in informed discussions about the challenges and opportunities facing this vital nation.